whispers of forgotten empires, echoes of lost gods, and truths buried in time. Welcome to Ancient Luminaries, where the ancient world comes alive.
Europe remembers Bernard of Clairvaux as a monk, but in his own lifetime, he was something far more unsettling, a man who tried to flee the world and ended up steering it. He preached humility while princes leaned in for advice. He built silence into a rule of life, yet his letters traveled like sparks across Europe. He wanted a faith stripped of comfort, and still found himself dragged into the biggest fights of his century over legitimacy, doctrine, and even holy war. Bernard's story is the story of what happens when moral authority becomes its own kind of power, and when a man who wanted only God is asked to carry the weight of an entire civilization's anxieties. Before the sun reaches the fields of Burgundy, the air can feel like iron. Breath comes out in pale clouds. Frost clings to the edges of stone. In the distance, a bell begins to ring, not like celebration, but like a command. It tells bodies to rise. It tells appetites to wait. It tells a mind, still half in sleep, that today will be shaped by a rule older than this morning. That sound mattered in the 12th century. Western Europe was not short on ambition. Lords built castles. Kings argued over borders. Merchants followed roads that grew busier every generation. Cathedrals rose, higher and brighter, as if faith itself wanted to be seen from miles away. The church was powerful enough to influence politics, taxes, and war, and it was wealthy enough to attract people who loved the comfort that wealth could buy. Yet in the shadow of that power, another hunger spread quietly. The hunger for a stricter life, a life where prayer was not a decoration but a discipline, and where the soul was not entertained but trained. If you enjoy stories like this, where history is told as a living journey, with real tension and real consequences, subscribe now and stay with us. The past is full of people who face choices that still echo inside modern lives, and Bernard is one of the most surprising of them all. Bernard would become a symbol of that hunger for strictness, and also a symbol of its dangers. To appreciate why the Cistercian reform mattered, imagine the spiritual landscape Bernard inherited. Monasteries had existed for centuries, and they were not all the same. Some houses became famous for their learning, their libraries, and their artistry. Some became famous for their landholdings and their influence with nobles. The most celebrated reform tradition before Bernard's time was associated with Cluny, a monastery that became a symbol of liturgical beauty and institutional strength. Cluny's worship could be lavish, extended, and glorious. Many people experienced that glory as a sign of heaven on earth. But wealth has a shadow. When a monastery controls land, it also controls rents. When it receives gifts from nobles, it also becomes entangled in noble politics. When liturgy becomes elaborate, it can become time-consuming, and the community can drift away from the manual labor that earlier monastic rules had emphasized. Reformers began to ask whether grandeur had started to blur into comfort. The Cistercians did not claim that beauty was sinful. They worried that comfort can sedate the soul. They wanted a monastic life that felt like a training ground rather than a court. The difference between reform movements could even be seen in stone and light. Cistercian architecture tended toward restraint. Carvings were fewer, gold was rare, images were limited. The point was not ugliness, it was focus. Bernard worried that the eye can become a hungry mouth, constantly feeding on decoration. If a church becomes a gallery, a worshiper may become a tourist. The Cistercians wanted their spaces to teach quiet rather than spectacle. Bernard's criticism of excessive ornament sometimes sounded harsh, and other monastic communities pushed back. Some argued that beauty can lift the heart. Bernard did not deny that. He feared the way beauty can be used to display wealth and to flatter donors. He lived in a world where nobles gave gifts to monasteries partly for piety and partly for prestige. If a monastery built grand architecture, it could attract more gifts and more attention, and soon the pursuit of glory could replace the pursuit of God. These tensions created real monastic politics. Bernard criticized abuses, and those criticized did not always take it gently. Yet Bernard's authority was hard to ignore because he could point to the simplicity of his own order as evidence that his critique was not merely jealousy. Their churches tended toward simplicity, their habits were plain, their food was modest, their rhythm emphasized work alongside prayer. They were not trying to insult other monasteries. They were trying to rescue monasticism from the softening that success can bring. This helps explain why Bernard's choice was so striking. Bernard's era also produced a remarkable counterpoint, Peter the Venerable, abbot of Cluny, a man associated with a more expansive and scholarly monastic culture. Peter was not Bernard's enemy, but their worlds represented different instincts within the church. Cluny prized liturgical richness and intellectual breadth. The Cistercians prized austerity and concentrated devotion. Bernard's criticisms could sound like a threat to Cluny's prestige. Yet history shows something more nuanced than a simple rivalry. When Abelard's conflict with Bernard reached its bitter end, Abelard eventually found refuge under Peter the Venerable's care. Peter treated Abelard with a kind of pastoral gentleness, and he sought reconciliation where possible. This is a reminder that medieval Christianity contained multiple temperaments, sometimes in tension, sometimes in unexpected cooperation. Bernard's sternness and Peter's moderation both shaped the landscape. By seeing these figures side by side, you can sense the church's internal struggle, how to preserve unity without crushing creativity, how to honor beauty without becoming luxury drunk, how to protect truth without turning faith into fear. A nobleman entering a strict monastery was like someone choosing the hardest path when easier, prestigious paths were available. It signaled that he wanted not only salvation but severity, not only faith but discipline. In a society that admired heroic sacrifice, strict monasticism could be a form of heroism that did not require violence. He would be praised as a saint and criticized as a partisan. He would be described as honey-tongued, as if his words could sweeten the hardest heart. He would also be blamed for stirring forces he could not control. He would live as a monk, yet he would influence popes and kings. He would preach humility, yet he would win arguments that shaped the intellectual life of his age. He would retreat into silence, yet his letters would travel across Europe like sparks on the wind. To understand Bernard of Clairvaux, you have to hold together two images that seem to contradict each other. One image is simple, a monk in a rough habit, walking through muddy paths, living with little, praying often, eating plain food, sleeping lightly, and training his desires the way an athlete trains muscles. The other image is immense, Europe's leaders leaning in to hear his counsel, monasteries multiplying under his influence, crowds pressing close as he speaks, and the great debates of his era bending toward his voice. He is born around 1090, near Dijon in Burgundy, into a family of the lesser nobility. His father, often described as a knight or lord of the area, represents the world of arms and status. His mother, remembered for her piety, represents a different inheritance, one that points toward devotion and restraint. Bernard grows up in a society where noble families still dream of glory through war, yet the church offers another kind of glory through holiness. In this era, the two worlds are not neatly separated. A knight can become a monk. A monk can influence wars. A mother can shape a son's destiny more strongly than a battlefield can. From a young age, Bernard shows the kind of intensity that can become either greatness or ruin. People later tell stories about his seriousness, his sensitivity, his desire for purity of heart. Some of those stories may be shaped by later admiration, yet they fit the pattern of a life that would become known for its concentrated focus. Bernard is not the type to drift. He is the type to decide, and then to give everything to the decision. He is educated in a context where Latin learning is valued and where the Bible is not simply read but memorized, interpreted, and applied. The spiritual literature of earlier centuries is still alive. The writings of Augustine, the sermons of earlier preachers, the monastic rules that describe discipline as freedom rather than imprisonment. Bernard learns that the Christian life can be imagined not merely as moral obedience but as desire redirected. He learns that the soul is not only a courtroom where guilt is judged, but a landscape where love can grow. Bernard's early environment also taught him something about persuasion. In noble households, speech is power. A well-placed word can negotiate a marriage, seal an alliance, or prevent a feud. A family learns how to speak in ways that protect status. Bernard would later use speech differently, but he did not grow up ignorant of its force. When he turned toward monastic life, the decision was not made in a vacuum. It likely cost him relationships. Friends may have called him extreme. Some relatives may have feared he was wasting a future. Yet Bernard's intensity was the kind that makes compromise feel like betrayal. If he believed the soul mattered more than prestige, then half measures would feel dishonest. Later writers loved to portray his conversion as a sudden lightning strike. The truth was probably more gradual. An accumulation of disgust with vanity, an attraction to purity, an awareness of death, and a growing conviction that the world's pleasures were too weak to satisfy a human being made for something greater. However it formed, the decision became permanent. What is remarkable is that he did not treat monastic life as a private preference. He treated it as a calling that could gather others. He spoke to friends. He spoke to brothers. He spoke to companions who had imagined lives of noble success. And one by one, they chose the same path. This is not only charisma, it is also the power of conviction. People can sense when a person is not performing. Bernard's seriousness may have frightened some, but it also attracted those who were secretly tired of pretending that comfort was enough. That language of love would become Bernard's signature. Yet in his youth, love appears in a more ordinary way first. He is a young nobleman. He is surrounded by peers who expect marriage, status, and worldly success. He is also surrounded by the romantic and violent ideals of the time, the idea that a noble life is a life of conquest, advantage, and honor. Bernard does not reject those ideals out of laziness or fear. He rejects them out of a conviction that the soul can be conquered by its own pleasures, and that the deepest battle is not against an enemy outside, but against the self inside. Around 1113, Bernard makes the decision that will define everything after it. He goes to Cîteaux, a young and strict monastery associated with the Cistercian reform movement. The Cistercians are trying to recover a simpler, stricter form of Benedictine monastic life. They emphasize poverty, manual labor, silence, and a return to the plainness of early monastic ideals. In a world where some monasteries have become wealthy and influential, Cîteaux is an experiment in austerity. It is not the fashionable choice. It is the hard choice. What makes Bernard's entrance into Cîteaux even more dramatic is that he does not go alone. He persuades others to come with him, including members of his own family. In later retellings, the scene becomes almost cinematic. A young man walking away from the privileges of noble life and taking others with him, like a tide pulling toward the sea. Whether or not every detail is exactly as later writers described, the core truth seems clear. Bernard possessed a persuasive intensity. People did not merely listen to him, they followed him. Cîteaux at that time is still fragile. Strict reforms are not automatically successful. Many people admired discipline from a distance and avoid it up close. A monastery that chooses poverty can struggle to survive. Yet the arrival of Bernard and those who join him becomes a turning point. His presence helps stabilize the community. His zeal attracts attention. The strict life begins to look not like a dead end, but like a path to power of a different kind. Moral authority. A few years later, in 1115, Bernard is sent to found a new monastery at Clairvaux. Founding a monastery sounds peaceful, but in practice it is a mixture of endurance and administration. A new abbey needs land, buildings, food, water access, and relationships with surrounding communities. It needs rules enforced, novices trained, conflicts managed, and a spiritual atmosphere maintained. It is both spiritual and practical. Bernard becomes abbot of Clairvaux, and the name will stick to him for the rest of history. Clairvaux grows rapidly. The founding of Clairvaux deserves a slower look, because it shows the kind of leadership Bernard actually practiced. Clairvaux was not founded in a city with existing resources. It was founded in a valley that needed to be shaped. A monastery is not a romantic hermitage. It is a community that must eat every day. To live in a Cistercian house like Clairvaux was to enter a rhythm that could feel severe to outsiders and strangely liberating to insiders. The day was structured around the hours of prayer, but prayer was not the only work. The Cistercians emphasized manual labor more strongly than many other monastic communities of the time. They wanted their hands to be honest. They wanted the body to share in discipline so that the mind could not pretend to be holy while the flesh remained pampered. At dawn, the community rose for prayer. In darkness, voices filled stone spaces, not with music meant to impress, but with psalms meant to reshape attention. The language of the psalms is full of fear, longing, gratitude, anger, and hope. It gives a monk permission to be human while also pulling the human heart toward God. After the office, there was work. Tending fields, caring for animals, repairing buildings, copying manuscripts, cooking, cleaning. Silence was valued, not as contempt for conversation, but as protection against the constant temptation to perform, to gossip, to manipulate, to seek social advantage. The Cistercians also developed an economic system that supported their growth. They organized agricultural outposts, often called granges, where lay brothers conversely could work the land while the choir monks focused on prayer and study. This system allowed the order to expand while maintaining a monastic identity. It also brought the monasteries into deeper contact with the rural economy. Clairvaux and other houses became places where spiritual ideals met the hard facts of harvests, weather, and labor. Bernard had to guide this system without letting it become a new form of worldly ambition. A monastery needed stability, but stability could slide into greed. Bernard's letters and sermons show his awareness of this danger. He wanted the order's material life to serve the spiritual life, not replace it. It must build shelter. It must manage seasons. It must deal with sickness. It must negotiate with local lords and peasants. It must establish fields, mills, and paths. It must form novices who arrive with enthusiasm and then discover that enthusiasm does not carry you through hunger and cold. Bernard's leadership combined spiritual intensity with practical endurance. He could speak of love for God in the morning and then supervise the hard labor needed to keep the community alive. He could correct pride in a brother and then assign that brother to ordinary tasks. He could insist on humility in theory and then demand it in the way a monastery actually functions. No one is too noble to dig, to carry, to repair, to endure. The landscape itself shaped the identity of the community. A valley can feel enclosed, like a bowl holding silence. The seasons can make the same place feel harsh or tender. In winter, stone feels cold enough to drain warmth from your hand. In spring, water runs louder and new growth appears where yesterday there was only mud. Monastic life makes a person intimate with cycles. It teaches patience. It also teaches that discipline is not a single heroic moment, but 1,000 ordinary choices. Clairvaux became famous not because it was comfortable, but because it was alive with purpose. Men came seeking a life that could not be bought. In a world where social standing could be inherited, monastic standing had to be earned daily through obedience and work. Under Bernard's leadership, the Cistercian movement expands across Europe. New monasteries are founded, many of them connected through a system that provides guidance, oversight, and shared identity. This is one of the reasons Bernard can be seen as more than a monk. He becomes a kind of organizational force. He helps shape a network. He influences culture through institutions, not only through words. Yet Bernard is not primarily remembered as a manager. He is remembered as a voice. Bernard's own body became one of the silent dramas of his life. The strict regime he embraced was not gentle. He fasted heavily, slept little, and pushed himself through long days of work and writing. Accounts from his era describe him as often ill, frequently weak, sometimes so fragile that observers wondered how he continued it all. The irony is sharp. He preached about love and sweetness, yet his discipline could be almost ruthless toward himself. This physical weakness did not reduce his influence. If anything, it intensified it. A sickly man who speaks with authority can appear almost otherworldly, as if he is powered by something other than ordinary strength. Yet weakness also shaped his temperament. When a person lives close to exhaustion, patience can thin. Bernard could be tender, and he could also be sharp. He could comfort a soul, and he could also strike with words when he believed pride or corruption was at work. His life shows that holiness does not erase temperament. It redirects it, sometimes successfully, sometimes imperfectly. Bernard's intensity could nurture spiritual depth, but it could also fuel conflict. The same fire that drew people into reform could burn those who resisted it. Inside monastic life, the voice matters in two ways. First, the voice shapes a community through sermons and teaching. Monks do not live together simply by sharing walls. They live together by sharing a vision of desire, discipline, and meaning. A community without vision becomes a prison. A community with vision becomes a training ground. Bernard's reputation for sweetness did not mean softness. The phrase often attached to him, honey-flowing doctor, suggests a style that could charm. Yet anyone who reads his letters discovers that he could be firm, even severe, when he believed the soul was at risk. His sweetness was not flattery. It was the sweetness of someone who wanted to persuade rather than crush. Letters in his era were not only personal notes, they were instruments of governance. An abbot could correct a distant monastery through letters. A pope could negotiate politics through letters. A king could seek advice through letters. Bernard's correspondence reveals a man constantly pulled into other people's crises. Someone is tempted to leave monastic life. Someone is in conflict with a neighbor monastery. Someone in authority is drifting into arrogance. Someone is anxious about salvation. Someone is wounded by scandal. Bernard writes into all of it. He encourages, he admonishes, he argues, he sometimes pleads, he sometimes threatens spiritual consequences. Yet beneath the variety is a consistent concern. He wants people to desire the right things. He wants them to love God more than status, unity more than faction, humility more than victory. This focus on desire is what gives his writing its distinctive flavor. When he speaks about sin, he often speaks about disorder of love. When he speaks about holiness, he speaks about love healed and redirected. Even when he is arguing about political legitimacy, he is still, in his mind, arguing about the soul. Second, the voice travels beyond the walls through letters. Bernard writes an enormous number of letters. They are not all polished literary exercises. Many are practical, urgent, specific. They address disputes, encourage individuals, correct behavior, comfort the wounded, and persuade leaders. In an age before modern bureaucracy, letters are the arteries of influence. Bernard's letters become one of the ways he reaches into the wider world without leaving the monastic identity that gives his words weight. The paradox begins to take shape here. Bernard is a man committed to withdrawal, yet the world keeps asking for him. Why? Because the 12th century is not only an age of power, it is an age of anxiety about power. When institutions grow strong, they also grow tempted. People sense corruption. They sense complacency. They sense that wealth makes the soul sleepy. Reform movements appear whenever societies begin to fear that their own success has weakened them. The Cistercian reform is one such movement, and Bernard becomes its most famous embodiment. But Bernard does not remain a private reformer. He becomes involved in the biggest public crisis of his age, a papal schism. In 1130, after the death of Pope Honorius II, disputed elections produced two claimants. One faction supports Innocent II, another supports Anacletus II. This kind of conflict is not only theological, it is political. It involves powerful families, alliances, and international relationships. When the papacy is divided, Europe's leaders must choose sides. A choice can determine who is seen as legitimate, who receives favors, and who has moral authority. Bernard throws his weight behind Innocent II. This is one of the moments where Bernard's influence becomes undeniable. He is not merely giving private advice. He is persuading rulers, bishops, and communities to recognize one claimant as legitimate. He travels, he negotiates, he argues, he uses moral language to frame a political choice. He becomes, in effect, a maker of legitimacy. This involvement is risky. The schism after Honorius II's death was not a distant ecclesiastical quarrel. It affected appointments, taxes, alliances, and the moral credibility of the church. Europe's leaders had to decide whom to recognize, and recognition was not neutral. If you recognized one pope, you might lose favor with the other faction. You might be treated as rebellious by a rival kingdom. You might find your bishops contested. Bernard approached the crisis with a mixture of principle and strategy. He believed unity mattered spiritually, yet he also understood that unity had to be built through persuasion. He traveled to meet rulers. He appealed to their conscience. He framed the choice as a defense of rightful order. He used his moral reputation as leverage, which is a strange phrase. Yet in this era, moral reputation was leverage. A holy man could shame a king. A holy man could reassure a wavering bishop. A holy man could give a political decision the glow of spiritual necessity. This is also where Bernard's personality comes into focus. He could be fearless in front of power. Monastic poverty made him difficult to bribe. His discipline made him look like someone who had already conquered the temptations others struggled with. That image increased his authority. People who are surrounded by flattery often hunger for one voice that cannot be bought. Bernard became that voice for many. Yet moral authority can become intoxicating even if you do not seek it. Once leaders treat you as a judge, you may begin to see yourself as indispensable. Bernard seems to have believed his involvement was reluctant. But reluctance does not remove responsibility. The choices he pushed others toward shaped the life of the church for decades. If Bernard chooses the wrong side, his reputation could collapse. If he uses his influence in a self-serving way, his holiness could be questioned. Yet Bernard is convinced he is defending unity and righteousness. He sees the schism as a wound in the body of the church, and he believes the wound must be closed for the sake of spiritual health. The schism eventually resolves in favor of Innocent II, and Bernard's standing rises even higher. People begin to treat him as a kind of conscience for Christendom, a man who can speak with authority because he is not seeking wealth. This reputation becomes one of his greatest powers and one of his greatest dangers. Once people think you are a conscience, they will listen to you even when you are wrong. Bernard's influence reaches into another surprising domain, the shaping of a new kind of religious warrior. In the early 12th century, the Crusader states exist in the Holy Land. Pilgrims travel, roads are dangerous, violence is common. A group of knights forms to protect pilgrims, and this group becomes known as the Knights Templar. They are not monks in the usual sense, and they are not knights in the usual sense. They represent a fusion, military discipline fused with religious vows. For such a fusion to be accepted, it needs legitimacy. It needs a rule. It needs approval. It needs a narrative that makes sense of the idea that a man can be both warrior and ascetic. Bernard helps provide that narrative. When Bernard defended the Templars, he was trying to solve a moral puzzle his era could not ignore. Knights were trained to fight, and their status often depended on conflict. The Church had long struggled to restrain violence through teachings about just war and through attempts to limit feuds. Yet violence remained woven into noble life. The crusading movement had already offered one spiritual frame for warfare. Fighting could be imagined as pilgrimage and penance if it was directed toward the defense of Christian holy places. The Templars added another layer. They wanted to live under vows like monks while also remaining armed. Bernard's support helped make this seem coherent. In praising the new knighthood, he contrasted it with what he saw as the vanity of ordinary knights who fought for pride, loot, or love of fame. He imagined the Templar as disciplined, obedient, and restrained, fighting not to enlarge the ego but to serve a sacred duty. From a modern distance, it is easy to hear the danger in this language. Once violence is described as holy, it can be hard to limit. Bernard himself was not blind to moral risk. He wanted discipline to be the boundary. He wanted obedience and rule to restrain passion. Still, the very act of sanctifying warfare creates a legacy that can be misused by those less disciplined than the ideal he imagined. This is part of Bernard's broader pattern. He tries to redirect powerful human impulses, ambition, desire, aggression, into forms he believes can serve God. Sometimes he succeeds. Sometimes the redirected impulse grows larger than the spiritual vessel meant to contain it. He is involved in the process that produces a rule for the Templars, and he also writes in praise of this new knighthood. He frames their violence not as ordinary aggression, but as service. He tries to distinguish between selfish killing and what he sees as disciplined defense of the sacred. Whether one agrees with Bernard's framing or not, the fact remains that he helps make a new social and spiritual category possible. This is where the story becomes morally complicated. Bernard's monastic ideal emphasizes humility and inner transformation. Yet his support for religious warfare suggests that he believes the external battle can sometimes be a form of spiritual obedience. In Bernard's mind, discipline can sanctify action. In modern ears, this can sound frightening. But in his century, the boundaries between sacred and political are not easily separated. The Church's authority is intertwined with the stability of kingdoms and the imagination of Christendom as a single civilization. Bernard is not a man of modern pluralism. He is a man of a medieval worldview that sees unity as survival. That worldview will shape his most famous and most controversial public act, the preaching of the Second Crusade. In 1144, the county of Edessa falls. This shocks the Christian world. Edessa is seen as a symbol of the crusading enterprise, and its loss signals vulnerability. Calls for action rise. Pope Eugenius III issues a bull calling for a new crusade. Yet calls on paper do not always move hearts. Something else is needed. Persuasion. Fire. A voice that can turn anxiety into commitment. That voice becomes Bernard. In 1146, Bernard preaches in places that matter. He speaks at Vézelay to a crowd that includes King Louis VII of France and Queen Eleanor. He calls people to take up the cross. Bernard's influence also crossed borders in a very practical way. When the Second Crusade needed support beyond France, Bernard traveled into the German lands to preach and to persuade. He spoke to nobles and common people, and he helped draw the German King Conrad III into the crusading project. In these travels, Bernard's reputation as a miracle worker sometimes followed him. Medieval audiences often interpreted intense spiritual authority through the language of wonders and healing. Whether every reported miracle happened as described is impossible to know, yet the reports tell us what people felt when they met him. They felt they were in the presence of a man whose life had been stripped down to essentials. These journeys were exhausting. Travel in the 12th century was slow, uncomfortable, and risky. Roads were rough, lodging was uncertain, illness could spread easily. Bernard's willingness to travel despite frailty reveals how seriously he took his public responsibilities, even when those responsibilities pulled him away from the monastic stability he loved. Here again, the paradox repeats. The monk who sought stillness kept being pushed into motion. He uses the language of devotion, obligation, and spiritual urgency. Accounts describe the crowd's response as overwhelming. The story becomes legendary. People eager to join, cloth running out for crosses, enthusiasm spilling beyond order. When you listen to this part of Bernard's life, it is tempting to imagine him as a man intoxicated with influence. It is also possible to see him as a man trying to defend what he believes is vulnerable and sacred. Either way, the consequences are immense. The Second Crusade becomes a mass movement involving kings and armies. It becomes one of the great projects of his age, and it fails. When Bernard preached the Second Crusade, he did not only preach to kings, he preached to ordinary people who were hungry for meaning. For many, taking the cross offered a way to turn a life of ordinary sin into a life that felt purposeful. It offered a story where sacrifice could erase guilt. Bernard's rhetoric spoke to that longing. He presented the crusade as a form of obedience and as a response to crisis in the Holy Land. Yet crusade preaching often had unpredictable side effects. In the Rhineland and elsewhere, some fanatics attacked Jewish communities, claiming they were enemies within or that they should be punished. Bernard's biographical tradition includes accounts of him intervening to restrain such violence, insisting that it violated Christian teaching. Even so, the fact that such violence flared reveals the volatility of mass religious mobilization. A crowd can turn piety into cruelty if leaders cannot guide its energy. Bernard's role in the crusade, therefore, carries a double legacy. He represents a moment when a spiritual leader could move Europe like a tide. He also represents the sobering truth that mass movements are difficult to control once released. The Second Crusade's eventual failure deepened that sobering truth. People who had taken the cross expecting victory and blessing returned with disillusionment. The world did not become clearer, it became more complicated. Bernard's critics seized on the failure. Some mocked him, some questioned whether his confidence had been arrogance. Bernard responded by pointing to sin, division, and human motives. He argued that God's purposes cannot be measured by immediate success. His reasoning comforted some and irritated others. In any case, the Crusade episode marked him permanently. It revealed the limits of even the greatest persuasion. The Second Crusade does not achieve its major goals. It ends in disappointment, loss, and confusion. When a project that was preached as spiritually urgent collapses, faith itself can wobble. People ask who misled them. People ask whether God was absent or whether the leaders were foolish. Bernard's reputation suffers. He is not destroyed, but a crack appears. The man who could persuade Europe is forced to face the reality that persuasion cannot guarantee providence. This is one of the most human moments in his story. A person can be brilliant, persuasive, and sincere, and still be wrong about what will happen. Bernard responds not by abandoning faith, but by arguing that human sin and human motives distort sacred projects. He insists that failure does not prove the call was false, yet he cannot erase the disappointment. It becomes part of his legacy whether he wants it or not. In the midst of these public storms, Bernard is also shaping the spiritual imagination of Europe through another kind of work: contemplative preaching and writing that describes the soul as a lover. The Song of Songs sermons show another Bernard, the Bernard who is not negotiating with kings but speaking to monks who are learning how to pray. He takes a text that many readers find puzzling, a poem overflowing with sensual imagery, and he insists that it belongs at the heart of spiritual life. He is careful with language, not because he is embarrassed by desire, but because he believes desire must be purified and redirected. In Bernard's hands, the poem becomes a map of spiritual longing. The bride represents the soul, the bridegroom represents Christ, the kisses represent intimate encounters with grace, the fragrance represents the sweetness of divine presence, the searching represents seasons when God feels absent, the union represents moments of spiritual joy, that cannot be forced but can be received. This approach is sometimes called bridal mysticism. It can sound strange to people who assume religion is mainly about rules or doctrines. Bernard is insisting that the heart is not secondary. He is insisting that love is the engine of obedience. If you only obey from fear, you will eventually resent. If you obey from love, obedience can become freedom. He also insists that spiritual life includes both consolation and dryness. The soul can feel close to God and then feel abandoned. Bernard uses the song to normalize that pattern. He urges patience. He urges humility. He warns against demanding constant sweetness, as if God were a servant of our emotions. For Bernard, the beloved is free. Love is not possession. Love is pursuit marked by reverence. This is why his writing continued to be read for centuries. It offers language for people whose spiritual lives cannot be captured by simple moral categories. It speaks to longing. It speaks to absence. It speaks to the ache of wanting something you cannot control. In that sense, it feels deeply human. His sermons on the Song of Songs become a long-term project. Another strand of Bernard's influence runs through his devotion to the Virgin Mary. Medieval Christianity was developing a rich Marian piety, and Bernard became one of its most influential voices. He spoke of Mary not as a replacement for Christ, but as a sign of gentleness, mercy, and human closeness within the story of salvation. For believers who feared judgment, Marian devotion could feel like refuge. For Bernard, Mary represented humility and receptivity, the soul saying yes to God without bargaining for status. His sermons and prayers helped shape later Catholic spirituality, making Mary central to the emotional vocabulary of devotion. Even many who did not follow his theology in full absorbed the warmth of his Marian language. This is part of why he was remembered not only as a controversial public figure but as a spiritual writer whose words could carry comfort. At the same time, Bernard's Marian devotion fit his broader emphasis on love. He wanted faith to be more than fear. He wanted the heart to be drawn, not merely driven. Mary, in his imagination, became one of the ways the Christian story could be experienced as tenderness as well as truth. The biblical text is a love poem, rich in imagery and desire. Bernard reads it not as a simple literal romance, but as an allegory of the relationship between Christ and the Church, or between Christ and the individual soul. He uses the language of longing to describe spiritual life. He speaks of kisses, fragrance, pursuit, absence, union. In his hands, theology becomes not merely argument but desire. The soul is not only a sinner seeking forgiveness, the soul is a lover seeking the beloved. This is where Bernard earns the reputation of sweetness. His style can feel intimate. He can make holiness sound like beauty rather than mere rule. He can describe God not only as judge, but as the one who is sought, adored, and enjoyed. At the same time, his insistence on a certain kind of spiritual authority leads him into conflict with one of the most famous thinkers of the century, Peter Abelard. Abelard represents a different energy. He represents the rise of dialectical reasoning, the sharp use of logic, the desire to systematize and question. He is brilliant, controversial, and admired by students. Bernard is suspicious of what he sees as intellectual pride, the temptation to treat mysteries as puzzles to be solved publicly in a way that can destabilize faith among the less trained. Their conflict is not simply personal, it is a collision between two models of knowledge. To grasp why the Abelard conflict mattered, you have to remember how rapidly intellectual life was changing. Cathedral schools were growing. Students traveled, teachers gained reputations, arguments spread beyond monastic walls. A new class of thinkers emerged, less tied to monastic discipline and more tied to public disputation. This public disputation could sharpen minds, but it could also reward arrogance. Bernard did not reject learning. Monasteries preserved learning for centuries. Bernard himself read widely and wrote with sophistication. What he distrusted was a style of learning that treated faith as a stage for brilliance. He worried that cleverness could replace holiness and that students could learn to win debates without learning to love God. Abelard, for his part, believed that careful reasoning could clarify faith and defend it from confusion. He did not see questioning as rebellion. He saw it as discipline of the mind. Yet Abelard's confidence and his willingness to phrase doctrines in provocative ways alarmed critics who feared that subtle speculation could unravel unity among ordinary believers. The council that condemned Abelard's propositions became a symbol of this tension. Bernard argued that some of Abelard's formulations threatened core beliefs. Abelard argued that he was being attacked without a fair hearing. Later centuries would debate who was right. The more important point for Bernard's story is that he chose unity and reverence over open-ended speculation. He treated the church not as an academic club, but as a body whose health could be harmed by public uncertainty. This choice reveals both his strength and his limitation. He protected a certain kind of spiritual stability. He also contributed to a pattern where intellectual creativity could be suspected and punished. The 12th century was learning how to balance faith and reason, and Bernard was one of the figures shaping that balance, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully. One model emphasizes humility, contemplation, and the shaping of desire through prayer. The other model emphasizes analysis, debate, and the sharpening of understanding through argument. Bernard believes the second model can become dangerous if it is not anchored in reverence. Abelard believes the first model can become anti-intellectual if it refuses to examine ideas carefully. In the early 1140s, Abelard's ideas are condemned in a council associated with Sens. Bernard plays a central role in bringing the condemnation forward. Abelard appeals to Rome, and the dispute becomes part of the wider debate over how theology should be done, who has authority, and how the church protects unity. It is easy to tell this story as a simple drama: Bernard the saint, Abelard the rebel, or Bernard the persecutor, Abelard the genius. Reality is more complicated. Bernard is not simply afraid of reason. He is afraid of pride, especially the pride that can use reason as a weapon. Abelard is not simply a hero of freedom. He can also be a man whose confidence outruns prudence. Their conflict reveals an age where the intellectual center of Europe is shifting. Universities and schools are rising. Theology is becoming more systematized. Monastic spirituality is being challenged by new academic forms. Bernard is trying to hold the soul together in the midst of that shift. Through all of this, Bernard remains, at his core, a monk. He returns to the rhythm of prayer and work. He continues to shape the Cistercian movement. He counsels leaders. He writes to popes, including Pope Eugenius III, who had once been associated with Clairvaux as a monk. Bernard writes a work of advice to him, urging humility and caution in the exercise of power, as if warning him that the papacy's greatness can become its trap. Bernard's life raises a question that does not stay in the 12th century. What happens when a person whose identity is built on withdrawal becomes the conscience of an entire civilization? The answer is never clean. Withdrawal can protect integrity, but it can also create a sense of certainty that ignores other perspectives. Influence can serve reform, but it can also create unintended consequences that reformers are not equipped to manage. Bernard's story moves forward on that knife edge. Bernard's story also invites a deeper question about reform itself. Reformers often begin with clarity. They see a problem, they see a drift, they see hypocrisy. They imagine a return to purity. That clarity is a gift. Yet reformers also tend to attract followers who are hungry for certainty, and certainty can become harshness if it stops listening. The Cistercian reform succeeded partly because it offered a clear alternative: simplicity, discipline, labor, and plain worship. For many monks, this was not oppression, it was relief. It cut through the distractions of wealth. It gave them a life that felt coherent. Bernard's preaching gave language to that relief. He could describe the strict life as freedom from the tyranny of appetite, but strictness can also become pride. A community can begin to believe that its austerity makes it better than others. Bernard knew this danger and warned against it, yet he could not erase it entirely. The very success of the Cistercians created new prestige. New abbeys gained land. New donors gave gifts. The movement that began as a protest against comfort could, over centuries, become comfortable in a different way. This is one reason Bernard's life remains so useful. He forces us to see that reform is not a single victory. It is a continual vigilance. The soul can turn even discipline into vanity if it is not watched. He also forces us to see that influence is a test. Many people imagine that if they had power, they would use it for good. Bernard had power of reputation, power of persuasion, power of moral authority. He used it in ways he believed were good, and sometimes those uses produced harm or disappointment. The Second Crusade is the clearest example. A good intention does not guarantee a good outcome. A holy reputation does not guarantee perfect judgment. And yet, if you look across Bernard's life, you also see a consistent attempt to keep returning to the center. He returned to prayer, he returned to humility, he returned to the idea that the heart must be reoriented by love. That is why the language of love in his sermons is not sentimental. It is strategic in the deepest sense. Bernard believed love is the only force strong enough to carry discipline without turning it into cruelty. Love can soften austerity without weakening it. Love can make obedience something chosen rather than endured. Love can turn a monastery from a machine into a family. Whether you share Bernard's theology or not, the insight is recognizable. People can follow rules for a while, but only love can make sacrifice sustainable. Bernard did not always live his insights perfectly, no one does, but he articulated them with such intensity that generations after him could return to his words and feel their own desires examined. As the years advance, the man who once persuaded others to leave the world begins to see how hard it is to change the world without being changed by it. In his later years, Bernard's tone often deepens. The youthful fire remains, but it is tempered by experience. He knows what it costs to be involved in public disputes. He knows how exhausting travel can be. He knows how easily people can misunderstand you and how difficult it is to correct the misunderstanding once it spreads. His relationship with Pope Eugenius III makes this visible. Eugenius had been connected to the Cistercian world, and Bernard felt both affection and concern. When Bernard wrote advice to him, he did not write like a court flatterer. He wrote like a father warning a son about a dangerous inheritance. The papacy, he insisted, can swallow a man's soul if he begins to love power for its own sake. A pope is surrounded by petitions, rivalries, and expectations. He can become addicted to decision-making, to being needed, to being obeyed. Bernard urged Eugenius to keep returning to prayer, to keep returning to simplicity, to remember that leadership is stewardship, not ownership. This counsel is one of the reasons Bernard's legacy is not only about crusades and conflicts, it is also about inner governance. He insisted that the first government is self-government. A person who cannot govern their desires will misuse any external authority they gain. By the end of his life, Bernard had become a symbol. Symbols can be admired, and they can also be attacked. Some people loved him because he represented purity. Others resented him because he represented criticism. Some saw him as a reformer. Others saw him as a meddler. Bernard carried all these perceptions and still returned to the monastic rhythm that had shaped his earliest decision. He continues to preach humility, yet he cannot avoid political entanglement. He continues to praise simplicity, yet he becomes a figure whose name carries prestige. He continues to speak of love, yet he is forced to speak in the language of conflict. Near the end of his life, his body weakens. The strict life is not gentle on flesh. Travel, fasting, sleeplessness, and constant strain take a toll. The abbey that once felt like a frontier now feels like a home whose walls hold decades of memory. Bernard dies at Clairvaux in August 1153, leaving behind a movement that has spread across Europe, a body of writing that will shape spirituality for centuries, and a reputation that will not stop provoking debate. After his death, the Church canonizes him as a saint. Later, he is declared a Doctor of the Church, a title given to those seen as having enduring theological importance. Long after Bernard's death, writers and artists continued to pull him into their own imaginations. Dante places him in the final reaches of the Divine Comedy as a guide toward the vision of God, suggesting that Bernard represented a purity of contemplative desire. Later reformers, including figures in the Protestant tradition, sometimes quoted Bernard because his language of grace and humility could be read as supporting their own emphasis on faith over mere works. Catholic writers celebrated him for his devotion, his reforming zeal, and his theological depth. In other words, Bernard became a figure claimed by many camps, which is usually a sign that his work touched something larger than the disputes of his own day. His legacy also shaped how later generations understood what a monk could be. He was not only a solitary, he was an organizer, a counselor, and a public moral voice. That model influenced later orders and later reformers, who believed spiritual integrity could give a person authority even in political affairs. The model is powerful, and it is also dangerous, because it can tempt spiritual leaders to overestimate their ability to manage the world's complexity. Bernard's life therefore remains a study in the cost of influence. His words could lift people toward holiness. His words could also move armies. The same mouth that preached humility could also set thousands on the road to war. That does not make him a simple villain. It makes him a reminder that human beings are capable of mixed legacies, even when they are sincerely devoted. His feast day becomes associated with late August. His words continue to be copied, quoted, argued over, and loved. Yet the most faithful way to remember him is not through titles. It is through the tension he lived. He wanted a pure heart, and he lived in a world of power. He wanted silence, and he was given a megaphone. He wanted love, and he had to manage conflict. He wanted to build monasteries, and he ended up shaping an age. That tension is why he still feels alive when you listen closely. Now, to see him more clearly, we need to return to the beginning again, not to repeat it, but to step inside it. We need to understand what kind of reform movement could produce a man like Bernard, and why his yes to monastic life became a force that pushed far beyond monastic walls. Because in Bernard's century, a monastery was not only a place where individuals withdrew from the world, it was also a place where Europe tested what it still believed about the soul.
Tonight's story comes to an end here, but the past never truly goes silent. It lingers like a candle's last glow, whispering its warnings, its wonders, and its unanswered questions into the present. If this journey moved you, leave a like, subscribe to Ancient Luminaries, and tell me in the comments